Hi, this is Mike Kelly. Welcome to another live stream video chat sponsored by The Record, NorthJersey.com, and the USA Today Network, New Jersey. Today, we're talking about the Bridgegate case. In a stunning and long-awaited decision, the United States Supreme Court reversed the convictions of two of Chris Christie's allies, Bridget Kelly and Bill Baroni. They had been convicted of fraud and wire fraud in the Bridgegate trial in 2016. They had appealed their cases all the way through the federal appeals levels and finally got to the Supreme Court. But the court today threw out their convictions and said essentially that the prosecutors had overstepped their bounds and misapplied federal law in charging them with fraud. So Baroni and Kelly are now free to go on with their lives. But the implications from this case are wide and they continue to ripple, not just politically, but also legally. And today we have a group of people that are going to discuss this. My first guest is David Greenberg. Mr. Greenberg is a professor of history and journalism at Rutgers University. His most recent book is The Republic of Spin, an inside history of the American presidency. He's also a contributing editor for Politico magazine and a former managing editor at the New Republic. David, thanks for joining us this morning.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Oh, glad you could join us. I should actually say this afternoon. What are your first thoughts about the Supreme Court's decision?
Well, I would say two things. In one sense, it's clearly a surprising decision in that I think anyone on any side of the aisle knows that there was a serious abuse of power here, real wrongdoing, a lot of evidence to support that. And the notion that it should go unpunished seems counter to all of our basic instincts about justice. On the other hand, if you're a Supreme Court watcher, it's probably not that surprising because there have been a number of cases like this in recent years where the court has overturned convictions on fraud, corruption, having to deal with political issues. Bob McDonnell from Virginia, there have been some others. And it suggests that the way the court is now looking at the application of these laws is they're saying to prosecutors, you're applying these laws way too broadly.
Right.
In fact, Elena Kagan, in writing this decision for a unanimous court, said, we're not saying these people did no wrong. We're not saying that Kelly and Baroni were set up or that they're innocent of all wrongdoing. We're saying that these particular laws that the prosecutors apply, these federal laws, can't be used for this kind of activity.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point you make. And I also am glad you pointed out that it was a unanimous decision. Having been in the courtroom for the trial itself, and I also went to Washington to watch the arguments before the United States Supreme Court, it seemed that the justices were going to throw out these convictions, but it was not clear how the votes would break down. I was expecting, some of the justices might vote to uphold the convictions. So it was a bit surprising. It was a unanimous decision. But the other point you make, I think, is well taken, and that is that in writing the majority or the unanimous decision, Justice Kagan pointed out that she was not forgiving Baroni and Kelly for what they did. And we should also note the other player here, David Wildstein, the renowned political dirty trickster and former Port Authority official who really was the mastermind behind the plot, but he was able to get off, so to speak, and not be convicted. He pled guilty and then testified against Baroni and Kelly. But I think what the question this raises is how do we look at this kind of political abuse of power and not have any consequences?
Right. And here, it's very easy for the Supreme Court to strike down, whether it's laws or convictions, much easier to build up. There was a time a few decades ago where the court was doing that a lot. They would have these tests, say, okay, well, this has been misapplied. for it to be applied properly, you need to meet these few criteria. Still happens sometimes, but that kind of rulemaking got criticized as legislating from the bench, that they were assuming the role of lawmakers rather than judges. And now with the conservative majority on the court, I think it's much harder for the court to find agreement in saying, here specifically is where the laws do apply. So if you get a unanimous opinion, it's much more likely to say, well, this won't fly. They don't have standing. This law is too broad, but much harder to get a real consensus on the court of saying, okay, here's what these laws mean. And I think over the last few years, the court has really thrown into great doubt a whole set of laws pertaining to political corruption and fraud for reasons that are complex. I mean, one last thing I'll say on this question, politics is about you do something for me, I do something for you.
Sure.
So inherently, there's a blurry line of what's legitimate political favor trading and what crosses the line into fraud, abuse of power, and other kinds of betrayals of the public trust. And legislators and U.S. Congress now, I think, have to get that sorted out and be much more explicit when they draw up laws about what counts and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the examples that was raised not only in the briefs to the Supreme Court, but also in oral arguments was the whole question of, suppose you're the mayor of a town and you want to punish someone on the other side of town so you don't plow the streets on that side of town during a snowstorm. Is that a crime? This, and some people would say it might be. In this case, I think the Supreme Court is saying that's not how we want public officials to behave, yet at the same time, that is not a crime. And that's the kind of activity that you point out that, politicians do all the time. They trade favors, they punish their enemies in various ways. And I think the court is basically saying to prosecutors, well, you might not like this, but this isn't necessarily a crime.
Right. And so what you might see coming out of not just this case, but some of the others in recent years is new efforts on the part of both state legislatures and U.S. Congress to say, okay, we're going to get much more specific about what is a crime, and here's why, so that prosecutors will have at their resource something more well aligned with these kinds of abuses of power or misbehaviors on the part of high officials. What the court was saying is, well, these laws you're using don't really fit.
Yeah, and do you think there could have been a law that would have fit here?
I don't know enough about the laws on the books to say, well, they should have used this statute instead of that statute.
Correct, yeah.
Probably most of us would agree this kind of behavior should be illegal if it isn't already. And so it then becomes incumbent on, again, both federal and state legislatures to define what kinds of actions governors and their surrogates can take as retribution, as political punishment, and what crosses the line into illegal behavior. And I think most of us would think something that has these terrible downstream effects on everyday commuters on the George Washington Bridge is something that should be punishable by law, even if it's not now.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. The whole, I think this was probably the grossest abuse of power that we've seen in New Jersey in a while, and we've sort of invented abuses of power in New Jersey. So
right.
that is saying something. And the fact that there was no legal implications here, or seems to be no legal implications, although there is a civil lawsuit that's slowly working its way through the federal system. One could say it's gridlocked. But I want to just switch subjects here in our final minute. What do you think in terms of impact that this decision may or may not have on politics here in New Jersey and the way it's conducted?
Well, I think things could cut one of two ways. On the one hand, you say maybe this is this is probably likely to increase cynicism, and you sort of throw in the kind of cronyism you see in the Trump administration, the way, his own business interest gets rewarded, and, Ivanka runs around promoting her business as part of the White House, and
sure,
or, his hotel. And you think, okay, there's going to be this increase in cynicism. And does that lead to kind of people throwing up their hands and saying, well, all politics is always like this? Or does it lead, as it has in some previous eras, to a new push for kind of good government reforms? And I could see it cutting either way, kind of depending on where our politics and our elections go in the next cycle or two.
As a historian, I wonder if you might be able to just talk for a moment here about where do you see the Bridgegate case fitting into political history in our country and perhaps even in New Jersey?
Well, I mean, it really is a kind of classic throwback. You can go back 100 years to the late 19th century, where all kinds of deal making and punishment and retribution was routine. And this spawned a whole movement for good government that came to be known as what we call the progressive movement, the progressive era, different sort of from the way the term is used today.
Sure.
Cleaning up the corruption. And it really did a lot to put in place laws, made elections cleaner, civil service reform. And, then again, in the Watergate era, that also led to a whole set of reforms to try to crack down on corruption and abuse of power. So I guess the optimist in me says, you look at this, some other recent Supreme Court cases, and I hope that enough people will say, okay, it's time for us to actually put laws on the books that will withstand scrutiny, even from a conservative Supreme Court.
Interesting. Well, Professor Greenberg, I appreciate you joining us this afternoon on such short notice. I'm going to switch now to two of my colleagues here at the Record, Dustin Raciopi, who was our lead reporter during the Bridgegate trial in 2016 in Newark, and also Charlie Stile, who's a political columnist for the paper. He's based in Trenton. Charlie and Dustin, I'm so glad you could join us today.
Good afternoon, Michael.
How are you doing, Charlie? And Dustin, how are you?
Doing all right.
Yeah. Let me begin first with Charlie. Charlie, let's talk about the political implications. Let's sort of dovetail into what Professor Greenberg was talking about what this might mean for politics. How do you see this ruling by the Supreme Court impacting or not impacting politics in New Jersey?
I think it's. I think the ruling is probably not going to have that much an effect. I think the fallout of this case from the beginning has had an effect. I think the collateral damage that it has caused and the attention that it drew, I think, will cause politicians of the old school, as the professor just mentioned, to take pause. That this is a line that can't be crossed. That's not to say you're not going to see the kind of corruption or that kind of brass knuckled sort of politics that has been standard forever. You mentioned the paving of the streets or preventing, stopping the paving of the garbage collection on the street of an opponent, that kind of thing. Firing of a political crony who's affiliated with your enemy. That kind of stuff is going to go on, and in this case, you could argue that this ruling today certainly certifies that. It ensures that it's going to happen if that. But this type of this taking it to this sort of DEFCON level of brass knuckle politics, I think the attention that it drew and the consequences for the principles involved will force a lot of people to take pause.
Dustin, you were in the courtroom every day during the 2016 trial. Were you surprised by the ruling?
In a way, I was surprised, but given the fact that it had bounced around in the courts, so much and made it up to the Supreme Court, you had to think that this was plausible. And obviously, the attorneys for Bridget Kelly and Bill Baroni felt strongly enough about this case that they had a shot of it getting overturned. I think, like you and the professor said, it's the unanimous decision that is probably more surprising, that liberal conservative justices all came together on this one particular case.
Sure. You know, one of the issues during that trial, Dustin, and Charlie and I were in the courtroom often with you, was the whole question of Chris Christie. We haven't really talked much about Christie here, but there were allegations that he knew about this beforehand and knew about it as it was happening. He denies that, of course, but his career was basically scuttled as a result of this. It was a very promising political career. He was literally, when this story broke, he was the leading Republican candidate for the 2016 presidential nomination.
Right.
Of course, that all went up in flames. Charlie, talk a little bit about that. You were out on the campaign trail a little bit in 2015 and 2016, and you watched some of this, watched Christie's campaign sort of implode because of this. How big an impact did Bridgegate have on his campaign?
Oh, it's undoubtedly it defined him, even though, as you said, there's no evidence that actually emerged in the trial that found the trial that would come after the campaign that linked him with any direct complicity in hatching the plot or early contemporaneous knowledge. Nothing that really could really stuck to him. But it definitely had an impact on him. When the irony is, a lot of people, you know, it certainly, as you mentioned, when he came out of his reelection with 22-point victory, he was sitting on top of the political world. He was anointed by a CNN poll as the putative early front runner for the Republican nomination. And then like 8 weeks later, boom, Bridgegate hits, and he never really could shake that. Surprisingly, and probably it's testimony to Christie's, native and nimble political skills, he staged a comeback on that presidential run. I mean, I was surprised that he ran, but he ran. He jumped in June of 2015, and then by that fall in New Hampshire, where he put a lot of attention and energy, he started gaining traction. He gets endorsement of the Times Union Leader, the conservative bellwether paper of New Hampshire, and every candidate, goes hat in hand, bowing and scraping for that endorsement. Chris Christie gets it, and he starts rising in the polls. And then who summons the ghost of Bridgegate? But none other than the leader in the polls at that time, Donald Trump. He just basically accuses Christie of knowing all about it. And then
it was like a Shakespearean ghost that suddenly walks on stage, and here we are. Yeah,
totally whacked him in the knees. And then Rubio, it was really Marco Rubio that did the most damage, and his super PAC aligned with him raised the issue, and Christie never recovered from it. But he was, despite all this, he was making an effort to come back. But in the end, the ghost haunted him too much.
Dustin, you're on the ground in Trenton every day now, watching. In fact, I know you've got to run to a briefing with Governor Murphy with the coronavirus pandemic. But what do you hear on the ground about Bridgegate from legislators and others down there now?
Well, it's clearly faded from the conversation because of coronavirus, but it hasn't been discussed much in recent years anyway. But it's become part of the Trenton lore, if you will, and it's always going to, no matter what happened today, unfortunately for Chris Christie, I think it's going to be something that's always going to be tied to him. It's going to be probably the first paragraph in his obituary, that it's just like an albatross hanging around his neck, and the Supreme Court reversing his decision doesn't change that for him. It's interesting today, he has not been in the public eye as much because he's not the governor anymore, although he is out there quite a bit as a political analysis on television. But he put out a statement today that just completely eviscerated the Obama administration and his successor as the U.S. Attorney, Paul Fisher, saying, you know, he just overstepped his bounds and he was wrong, and look at all the damage he caused. And Christie claimed exoneration. So I'm sure that it's very pleasing for him. He feels vindicated, but you know, anytime you see a traffic cone in Trenton, or you see a lot of traffic somewhere at a bridge in North Jersey, somebody is going to crack a joke for the foreseeable future about, you know, somebody shutting down a bridge or some sort of political trick.
Yeah, this became not only a source of outrage for many people, but it also, I think, became a joke as well. Charlie, how do you think this played out on the national scene, you know, in terms of what it meant for New Jersey's image, and not only just politically, but also just, you know, the way the rest of the country sees our state?
That's, you know, it's kind of hard to tell, but I would think it just reinforces the worst stereotypes as this Jersey as this fetid swamp of corruption where anything goes, and you got a bunch of, you know, guys playing brass knuckle politics and doing, you know, whacking people at the closing the world's busiest bridge as payback. And it just, you know, it's, well, to use a current phrase, it's not a good look. And it just really, I don't think we're going to be able to shake. I mean, you go from the pollution in down by the Bayway plant in Linden, and that's an you know, an enduring image. And then you go to the Turnpike a little bit, and we have this. I just think people see Jersey as a sort of corrupt backwater to New York, and I don't see it changing anytime soon.
Dustin, looking back at the trial itself, what to you was one of the more dramatic moments that stuck in your mind?
There's so many to choose from. I mean, every single day of that trial, we were rushing out, or I was rushing out, and my colleagues were rushing out at every opportunity, every break, to go file a news story or an update because something so juicy and salacious came out. And a lot of it was conflicting information. You know, somebody said, you know, Bridget Kelly said Christie threw a water bottle at me.
Right.
That was a memorable moment. But I think probably the ultimate memory that sticks with me is the attorney for Bridget Kelly, Michael Christie, in his closing arguments to the jury, trying to pull Christie into this and then saying, why isn't he on the stand? Christie, where are you? And he's shouting to the jury, Christie, where are you? And it was just unbelievable.
Yeah, I was there as well.
Yeah.
Well, we will leave it at that, and who knows what may be in store in the future years as a result of this. For my colleagues Dustin Raciopi and Charlie Stile, I'm Mike Kelly. Thank you for tuning in.